Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Welcome everybody to our session number 9. As other people start to enter, here we are. There are people coming in, joining us. Fantastic. Here we are. People are coming in. All right. So we're going to finish this week the chapter of Idris, the chapter of Enoch, and then the following week we will start the chapter of Abraham. I will talk a little bit more after I finish reading this about what we're going to do for the rest of the course. I've kind of thought about as these chapters start to get shorter, especially the next one is quite short, even though they're compact, we'll try to cover them in one session instead of 2 sessions. We'll leave the 2 sessions for the longer chapters that are coming up, like Joseph, Jesus, and Muhammad are going to need at minimum at least 2 sessions. But the shorter they get, if these chapters don't exceed anywhere between 5 to 6 pages in at least the Austin version, let alone the Arabic, then we'll just cover them all in a single session from now on. This way we can also then get through to the book much faster. And if people want to go back at a later time, either to review the videos or to, immerse themselves more in what particulars of that shorter chapter is about, they can do so. But this way we can get through it because there seems to be also a need by other people who are writing me for other courses. And I mentioned in the Telegram group that I've kind of been playing around with the idea that after we finish the Bezels of Wisdom, I might think about doing a course on Suhrawardi's Hikmat al-Ishraq. There's only one issue for the non-Arabic reader. The current translation that we have for Suhrawardi's Hikmat al-Ishraq is not a great translation at all. It's actually quite obtuse. That's the translation made by John Walbridge and Hossein Ziai. I personally dislike Walbridge on a litany of issues. He's just, he has the charisma of chalk and the finesse of even less than that. And especially where Suhrawardi is concerned, and he's turned and transformed Suhrawardi into this lifeless Aristotelian logician that he wasn't at all, even though he's using the Avicennan categories. And the translation that he makes of the Hikmat al-Ishraq reflects that in every conceivable way. So what we can do, and I'm thinking about how to get around this, is if we do a course on Suhrawardi after this, then what I might do is amend either the existing translation that we have of Walbridge and Ziai's text, and possibly then incorporate, at least for the second part of the book that Corban translated into French, where I would incorporate basically Corban's French, translated it into English, so that the nuances that Corban, for example, picks up in that second section of the Hikmat al-Ishraq would be covered. Because he is good, even though he didn't cover the section on logic and epistemology, he did cover the second half of Hikmat al-Ishraq quite well, translated it with a very nice commentary. So we might do that. I might need help in that regard from someone else, so a co-moderator who would help me collate the text. The good thing about the Bezels of Wisdom is that we have 3 and more translations of this. So for non-Arabic readers, they can jump back and forth between these various translations of the Fusus al-Hikam. But with the Hikmat al-Ishraq, there's only that one English translation by Walbridge and Ziai, then there is, there's Corban's French. So if anybody's a grad student in Islamic studies who has a versatility in Arabic and especially is trained in philosophical Arabic, this is a cue for you to think about seriously about offering a new translation of the Hikmat al-Ishraq, because, Walbridge just completely, in my opinion, just turned this text into a complete dog's breakfast. Anyway, enough of my rant about John Walbridge. Anyway, let's dig into this second half of the chapter of Idris or Enoch of the Fusus al-Hikam, where Ibn Arabi says, quote, each unit is a reality in itself, like 9 or 10 down to the lowest 2 or upward and ad infinitum. Although none of them are comprehensive, each of them being a particular collection of ones. 2 is unique and 3 and so on, even though all are one in being made up of ones. Nor does a particular number embrace other numbers essentially. For the fact that all numbers are collections of ones establishes at once that as being different collections, they are relatively unique, and that as being multiples of one, they derive entirely from the one. Inherent in all this are the 20 groups, and then Austin has it in brackets, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, all the way to 1,000. These are the units then in their groupings of ones, 20s, hundreds, and 1,000 that then constitute the abjad letters, the letterism, according to a particular construction. Thus, in saying that all numbers are one reality, one must also say that the one is not the numbers, being the origin. Whoever has understood what I have said about the numbers, namely that to deny them is to affirm them, will know that the transcendent reality is at the same time the relative creature, even though the creature be distinct from the creator. The reality is at once the created creator and the creating creature. All this is one essence, at once unique and many, so consider what you see. So consider what it is that you see. Isaac said to his father, O father, do as you are commanded, for the son is the essence of the father. Abraham saw only his own self to be sacrificed. Then we ransomed him with a mighty sacrifice, so that which had appeared in human form appeared as a ram, whereas it had appeared in the form of a son, or more precisely in the form distinguishing father and son, since the son is in reality the essence of the father. He created from it Adam's soulmate, its mate, so that Adam's consort was nothing other than his essential self. From him came forth both mate and child, for the creative command is one in multiplicity. And get more people in. Who else is the universal nature, and who else is manifest in her many forms? We observe that nature suffers no loss in displaying her forms, nor yet any increase in re-assimilating them. What is manifest is she herself, just as she is not what is manifest from the standpoint of formal distinction. One particular manifestation is cold and dry, while another is hot and dry. They are both one as regards dryness, but otherwise distinct. Nature, or rather the essential nature, is that which unites all of them. The natural order, whoever has their microphone on, please turn it off. Thank you. The natural order may thus be regarded at once as many forms reflected in a single mirror, or as a single form reflected in many mirrors. This notion causes nothing but confusion to the sense-bound mind, because of the divisive nature of its apprehension. I cannot recommend highly enough, if people can find it, to find a hall of mirrors and sit and contemplate what Ibn Arabi is talking about. I found, like I mentioned in one of the previous sessions, I found one of these in Berlin, and I went to it, a couple of times, just sitting in that place and just contemplating these various passages that Ibn Arabi talks about, and you get it very, very swiftly when you do that. So he says, he who truly understands what we're discussing here is not confused, even if his knowledge is extended. The extension is only the result of the determination of the location, which is nothing other than the immutable essence in respect of which reality is formally diversified from the theater of his self-revelation. These locational determinants seem to diversify him, but it is he who absorbs every determinant. There's a very key point here in understanding wahdat al-wujud, and why this is not pantheism. He himself being determined only by his own self-manifestation or tajalli. There is not but he or it. In one sense, the reality is creature, so consider. In another, it is not, so reflect. Whosoever grasps my saying, his perception will not dim it. Nor may one grasp it save to be endowed with perception. Whether you assert unity or distinction, the self is unique, as also the many that are and yet are not. It who is elevated in itself enjoys the complete perfection in which all realities and relationships, determined or undetermined, are immersed, since none of the attributes can possibly apply to other than it. This means all realities and relationships, whether they be in the eyes of convention, reason, or law, praiseworthy or otherwise. This applies only to the reality as God, the name uniting all names, means the name Allah. As for the reality as other than God, as manifested in some place or form, then qualitative disparity necessarily occurs as between one location and another. If the form be a synthetic form, the perfect man or complete man, it embraces essentially the essential perfection, since it is identical with the universal location in which it is manifest. The all-embracing totality inherent in the name Allah, God, is implicit in that form, which is at once not it and not other than it. Abu al-Qasim bin Qisi alludes to this in his book, The Shedding of the Sandals, Khal al-Na'alain, where he says, quote, every divine name is invested with all the names, unquote. This is because every name implies the essence as well as the particular aspect it enshrines. Therefore, insofar as it implies the essence itself, it partakes of all the names, whereas as evincing the particular aspect of the essence, it is distinct and unique relatively. In this latter sense, it is differentiated from every other name, such as Lord, Rab, Creator, Khaliq, Fashir, Musawwir, and so on. In the former sense, the name is essentially the one name, al-Musamma, but other than it as representing some particular aspect. If you have understood the elevation I have discussed, you will note that it is elevation neither of position nor of a degree, which takes me back to my point that I made last week in one of the questions, is that, for example, what we are speaking of certain, like for example, the first chapter of the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, when Ibn Arabi has that vision of the evanescent eternal youth, even though that it is occurring in a makan, in a place, the entire discussion is about makana or degree. So here he's actually now saying exactly what I was pointing out, that in relation to God, and when we're talking about certain elements of the names and attributes and the relationships, things, it is neither place or degree. And he says, as regards the latter, it is peculiar to persons in power as sultans, governors, ministers, judges, and every holder of office, be they worthy of it or not. Self-sufficient elevation is not of this kind. It is quite possible for the most knowledgeable of men to be under the control of the most ignorant who happens to hold a powerful office. The elevation of the latter is entirely relative to the office he holds, while the former is elevated in himself. When the holder of office ceases to hold it, his elevation ceases also. This is not the case with a man of true knowledge. Okay, that was the chapter of Idris, Enoch. Floor open. Questions, comments, insights.
Yeah, so there was one passage where you basically said that it's particularly incisive towards people who accuse Ibn Arabi of being a pantheist. I was wondering if you could expand on that a bit.
Sure.
It was a bit unclear to me.
Okay, pantheism, right? This is a term that gets thrown around, and during the last century, especially the first half of the century, whenever discussing Sufism in Western scholarship, it was bandied about without any critical comment. Pantheism assumes a extended substance, right? In the terms that the Greeks use, the word ousia. So the only pantheist in the history of philosophy that can be strictly called a pantheist is Baruch Spinoza, and in his book, The Ethics, because he's very unequivocal and he's very monochromatic in the way that he lays this down, that when we're talking about God, we're talking about infinite substance in the sense of ousia. But this is not what Ibn Arabi is saying at all, right? Because with the dialectic of Spinoza, you cannot hold that something is God and not God at the same time by virtue of extended substance, of this extended ousia, which is the being of God. This is not what Ibn Arabi is saying, right? First of all, Ibn Arabi is not holding God as being substance and nothing else, right? He's not saying that God is ousia. He's saying that God, that ousia or substance emerges from the self-disclosures of God, but that the being of God, the essence of God, and especially in its essentiality, in its absoluteness, is not substance. It transcends even that category of substance, right? So this is where this discussion gets extremely interesting, and especially in the debates that you have had for the last 800 years, is that when, for example, the followers of Ibn Arabi and Mullah Sadra talk about the simplicity of being, they're not denoting wujud by the way that the Peripatetics or even the Avicennians understand wujud as substance, albeit not a quiddital substance, a universal one. And when the other side, usually the followers of either Sohrawardi or some of the minor peripatetic figures talk about the essentiality of essence or quiddity, right? This is a very important point, and one that must be understood where Ibn Arabi is concerned, is that wujud is not substance. Wujud is not johar, right? Johar is an outcome of wujud. It is not an intrinsic element of it, right? And this is why Mullah Sadra states at the very beginning of his Hikmat al-Arshiyah, where he says, Basit al-Haqiqa kull ashya, the simplicity of all things is all things, right? By Basit al-Haqiqa, he is not implying Johar, even though Johar becomes a very important element of his overall argument about motion in substance. But Johar in itself is a derivative of wujud, right? Whereas with Spinoza, it is not, right? With Spinoza, God is Johar. It is substance. It is ousia. So that is pantheism. Whereas with Ibn Arabi and Mullah Sadra and the school that looks on, that basically predicates his argument on the primacy of existence, because existence is not substance, therefore we cannot actually categorize and define being. It is the undeterminate universal. And because it is the undeterminate universal, and because it is not substance, in logic, you can say both it is God and it is not God, or instantiations of it are God and not God. But when you posit substance as being universal extension, that argument does not hold, because substance is indivisible, is divisible, whether by itself or other things. And so that becomes a pantheism, whereas this is not pantheism. It's not. I mean, you could very vaguely posit monism, which was a term that was then qualified around the 1940s by certain people to kind of describe, the Indian thoughts, the Vedanta, and etc. But even that is quite misleading, because within this, both within the Vedanta and in the theosophy of Ibn Arabi, there is this constant dialectical interplay of negation and affirmation in everything that is being said. There's this constant shift back and forth between saying something is and something is not. and something being itself and not being itself simultaneously, right? Neither monism or pantheism, if you reduce them to a logical, scheme, can, because of what they're admitting, admit to this. So that's basically one of the difference between a strict pantheistic model and one that is not pantheistic. Now, if usually in philosophy, the opposite of pantheism is dualism, right? And this is where I think Western philosophy, up until probably recently, has been at a significant handicap in its own definitions of ontology, because what Ibn Arabi's and systems of in India, like Vedanta or the Tao, or etc., prove is that this is a fallacy. To say that our terms of saying everything is God does not mean that everything is not God. It's not dualism, like in the kind that, for example, you find in Gnostics or even in conventional theologies that put, moderately dualist, that put a gap, a chasm between the creator and the creature. So this dichotomy and this dialectic between pantheism and dualism itself is misleading. Now, and especially with people who have worked on texts such as Ibn Arabi, or the Vedanta, and etc., of the last 50, 60 years, there are better terms being coined all the time to try to explain, what this vision is, what this scheme is, etc. But it is not pantheism. It's something entirely different. It's not dualism either, but it's not pantheism at the same time. It can incorporate both of those terms simultaneously while being far more nuanced in its articulation of both at the same time, and unifies both of them at the same time. And the perfect example for me, in what I just said, is the very first couple of sentences of the chapter of Adam, where God is, creating, that where even the Arabic talks about the vision of something within oneself versus the vision of something within the other. And that is the basic premise upon which the creation of Adam occurs. And that God creates Adam as the Kon al-Jame, as the universal being, acting as the mirror for self-contemplation of the divine names and attributes.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. Anybody else? Don't be shy. Stephen, you've never spoken. Say something. Can't hear you. And you have no sound. Yeah, either your mic is off or something like that. Doesn't matter. It's okay. Come on, somebody who hasn't spoken before. Roger Calista, I see you're here today. Why don't you grace us with a visit?
Hi, good night, Wahed. How are you?
Good.
Yeah, so thank you all so much. I mean, I joined a bit late this evening.
Okay.
Yeah, I was actually wondering, because I appreciated what you had to say about the concepts of Ibn Arabi. And the fact that the negation, not this, it reminded me of the concept in Hinduism, neti, not this, not
exactly.
that.
That's precisely what we're talking about. Yes.
Yes. What I would like to do, I want to throw it into another sphere, because
Okay.
I was trained in Western, the so-called Western esoteric tradition, but my focus is in ancient Egyptian sacred science. And I'm very much interested in the fact that, Egypt had this pantheon of gods and they call it Neter, the forces of nature. But when you go into the deeper aspects of ancient Egyptian sacred science, everything goes back to Amun Ra. All of the gods are really hypostasis of the divine deity. how does that, I'm just trying to figure out, how does that sit with
Very
Ibn Arabi's?
perfectly. We actually touched on this in one of the earlier sessions.
Yes.
I would even go further back. I mean, Amun-Ra is a new kingdom deity. Let's go back to the
Yes.
old kingdom itself. To that period that scholars now call the theology of Heliopolis, of On. And
Yes, yes.
from what we understand, the concept of Atum and Atum Ra, the
Yes.
rising sun and the setting sun, it was exactly that thing.
Yes.
Such that it was the Godhead. And then once, the cultus of worship shifted from On to Memphis, the priests of Ptah did exactly the same thing with Ptah, where Ptah becomes the creator god or the Godhead, and all these various neters or neteru kind of emerge as hypostases of Ptah. So this idea has been around, and the ancient Egyptians very much subscribed to it, where the gods or the neters, these forces of nature, or whatever you want to call them, however you want to define them, are really aspects of the one unnameable. And throughout Egyptian ancient Kemetic religion, in all of its various instantiations, just like in High Hinduism, this was the basic understanding. Some of the scholars only now are beginning to kind of explain this and how your average Egyptian during the Pharaonic period was relating to the individual gods. How did they even conceive of this greater theology from this standpoint? And it appears that even your average Egyptian about 3,000 years ago had this basic understanding. So in essence, ancient Egyptian religion in all of its various phases kind of held to a notion of Tawhid that was extremely complex. Algis Gustavinis in his books has kind of really tickled all of this out in his various analysis.
Yes, he has, of course.
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
Fantastic. Yes, great. Yes,
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, and he's done an absolutely amazing job, in my opinion, in delineating all of this stuff. So, which essence then places a figure such as Ibn Arabi as kind of an Abrahamic version, articulating the same sort of general cosmology, with obvious differences in detail and emphasis and approach, etc. So this kind of approach is as old as humanity itself, and this is where it gets very interesting that then this whole binary and dichotomy that we find in the standard Abrahamic narrative of religions, in a sense, becomes a joke from many angles. And it's really it has always been the mystics and esotericists who seem to have, reestablished the correct understanding of these things. I've coined a term, by the way, it's going to be in the book of the Tree of Hermes when I eventually finish this book. And I took this from Corban, but I've kind of extended the term. Corban talks about harmonia Abrahamica. I am now talking about harmonia paganorum Abrahamica.
Oh, okay.
So such that within the mystical and esoteric landscape of the Abrahamic religions, we have a genuine sympathy with the high pagan understandings of, the ancient Egyptian, Assyro-Babylonians, etc. And it was my friend Habib Shahbazi who really initiated me into the whole Mesopotamian milieu of this, and he's a walking encyclopedia of that entire period. And you see it in the drawings that he made of those cards for the Nur Tarot. So once you start to look into this, this is very much the case. So in essence, one can also say that Islam, in many ways, is kind of a at least in its kind of theosophical thrust that it is embodied in someone like Ibn Arabi, is very much a re-articulation in an Abrahamic garb of that very wisdom, in every conceivable way. Where then you take the standard narratives, whether from the Quran or whether from the Old Testament or New Testament, and basically rework it to mirror that ancient wisdom of antiquity. I mean, not only do I not have any problem with this, I think this is the only route of resolution to the problems that these exoteric Abrahamic religions, pose in their kind of straitjacketed approach to the bigger question.
I definitely concur. Yes,
Yeah.
I definitely agree. Much agreed. Yes. Thank you so much. Yeah,
You're
thanks.
very
Thanks
welcome.
for that.
Very welcome.
Yes, yes. Okay, good. Yes.
Anybody else?
Then can we say that the dichotomy between monotheistic religions and polytheistic religions, it is modern construct which does not apply at all to the understanding of the ancient
And this is, in my opinion, something I believe very strongly Ibn Arabi had stumbled on, and that is what the chapter of Noah represents. That Ibn Arabi himself had stumbled on. Just remember, when Ibn Arabi had composed the Bezels of Wisdom, it's the time that he had gone through Egypt and was living in Damascus, so he had probably even seen during his wanderings, the ruins of ancient Egypt and also the ruins of Assyria, Babylonia. So besides his own insights and personal insights and whatnot, it is obvious that he was also observing the history of the places that he was at. And as for any mystic who passes through these places, they cannot but fail to reach certain insights about the greater questions as a result of witnessing these ruins. So it's this whole question that Ibn Arabi poses, which we'll see in another form when we get to the chapter on Moses, I think is very much apropos that from one angle, polytheism poses an intellectual problem, not an ontological problem, to the question of Tawhid, right? But simultaneously, the way that Tawhid is articulated by standard, popular theology is itself posing an intellectual problem to Tawhid. So there's no escaping this conundrum other than the resolutions that figures such as Ibn Arabi kind of present. That is the only solution possible, where polytheism and monotheism are really two sides of the same coin, and neither monotheism is real Tawhid, nor is polytheism, capturing the essence of the totality at the same time. So, but the mystery religions grasp this, and we have evidence of this from numerous angles. The Corpus Hermeticum, even though it is a production of late antiquity, or at least early late antiquity, nevertheless, I do take these people's word for the fact that what they have codified in these various texts of the tractates of the Corpus Hermeticum reflect a much earlier, basically master narratives, many of which were obviously from Egypt, because at least in the last 100 years of Egyptology, in all of its various facets that have now been specialized, we have learned quite a lot about how incredibly sophisticated and nuanced these ancient Kemetic cosmologies actually were. And so when scholars have analyzed a lot of the frescoes, like, for example, what they found in the calendar of Dandara, and what this calendar actually entails, that it's not just a calendar, but it's also both a cosmological map as well as being a kind of a cosmogonic kind of narrative all at the same time. What we're learning from that is how mind-bogglingly deep these ancient Egyptians were, at least their priesthood, the real caretakers of this mystery religions, or in all of its various forms. And then this kind of raises the question as to what happened then during that New Kingdom reign of the Pharaoh Akhenaten. What was really that all about? What really happened? What was the conflict that emerged? Was it really political in nature, or was it as we thought we had resolved, was it theological, basically? And this raises a lot of questions, but on the very basics of ancient Egyptian cosmology, cosmogony, and even metaphysics, these people were completely on the same page with a figure such as Ibn Arabi. It's just that their registers and their semantics and their emphasis was culturally different, and that's it. And you find the same thing in Mesopotamia, almost identically.
Yeah, Sheikh, I wanted to ask you about the relation, your thoughts on the relation that Ibn Arabi was doing on Enoch and the celestial bodies, and also he put some math on the mix, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that has something to do with it. What do you think?
Well, the numbers that he lays out he's laying it out as an example. Last week I mentioned that the argument that Ibn Arabi is making about numbers is almost identically the same one that the Bayan makes in its own metaphysical discussion, and that is the concept of the Wahid bila Adad, the one outside of number or enumeration, and al-Rakam, al-Ahad bila Rakam, the singular without enumeration. These two concepts are very condensed form. What Ibn Arabi is saying here is that number in itself is the replication of the one, which Ibn Arabi holds not to be a number, interestingly enough. And then the examples that he gives in the units of examples that he gives are straight out of the procession of the Abjad or the letrist, from Aleph to Qain, which I find very interesting. But this is a very important central argument. It's extremely Pythagorean or Neo-Pythagorean in the way that he lays it out. So it is a very important argument. It's actually very similar to the kind of arguments that contemporary mathematics itself is holding about the nature of number. And I've seen, certain of these figures, contemporary figures talk about one as not being number. When we're talking of the single unit, it is not a number at all. So what Ibn Arabi is saying is basically what a lot of contemporary maths is now beginning to say as well. And then he's using this to example what he is talking about in terms of Allah being in everything, and then everything being both unique and also being ingodded at the same time. As far as the celestial bodies argument goes, that happens at the very beginning of this chapter of Idris. It's a very beautiful passage. The only thing is that the scheme that Ibn Arabi lays out is his own. And it doesn't follow either the astrology of the ancients in the way that he lays out what occurs where, nor does it follow the scheme of his own contemporaries and subsequents either. So it's uniquely his own scheme. And you find this also re-articulated in a different way in his Futuhat al-Makkiyah several different times.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's about, you were saying about it on the first part about it being unguarded, and you were talking previously about pantheism. There's this other turn to that movement that was pantheism that I think also has to do with that of the numbers and everything.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
And this is actually a good point. It nuances this whole thing. Pantheism by itself would not recognize the argument that Ibn Arabi is saying that one is not a number and that one is contained in every single number in an infinity. It can't recognize that. Basically, pantheism would say that all numbers are one, but not all numbers are not one, right? Whereas Ibn Arabi is making a very subtle distinction here, is that the presence of one is in all numbers, but that every single number individual is his unique self, while one being present in every infinite number there is. This is much different than what the pantheists are saying. Because like I said, the pantheists are taking God and divinity as infinite substance. This is not infinite substance, right? Because infinite substance, in the way that Ibn Arabi is putting it, does not admit to the kind of division that Ibn Arabi is making of it, where the one is both present in the number and is also transcending that number in itself. So that number is both unique and not unique simultaneously. Pantheism doesn't recognize that.
Yeah, I was actually mentioning panentheism. The when they did that turn to the term of the movement, where you put the en right before the
Panentheism. That is a kind of a
Yeah.
qualification on pantheism, panentheism, everything being in Godhead. I think that is a closer term than the pantheism of before, and it's definitely better than monism. But even still, I think there are slight problems of subtlety when you use that term with these philosophical terms. I don't use these terms. I either use the term tawhid, or I just say outright wahdat al-wujud, even though that's not a term that Ibn Arabi himself was using. And what I mean by wahdat al-wujud is basically what Ibn Arabi means by it, and that is that we're talking about the unity of the existence of God with itself. Rather, so that what then this allows is exactly the kind of dialectic that Ibn Arabi is constantly pushing, where things participate in unity to the degree that they participate in God, and vice versa. But that the unity in itself is separate. So that on the one hand, we have the Khaliq and Makhluk, the creator and created dichotomy, firmly in place. But at the same time, because of the relationship of Khaliq and Makhluk, a lot of these terms can be reversed, depending on the perspective. This is what Ibn Arabi himself alludes to very explicitly when he's talking about, the created creator and the created creature, right? This is basically what he's alluding to in this particular passage of this chapter. Anybody else?
Sidi, if we can talk little about the etymology of names here, which Idris is the I don't know. Here in the English version, it is Enoch.
I know.
As far as I know, this name, the Arabic version of it is Uknuh. It is
Yeah.
not Idris, but Idris, the closer what comes to my mind, Hermes in the Greek
Absolutely.
tradition.
100%. Yeah.
Can
Yeah.
you elaborate more on it?
This has been a argument and a debate within not just contemporary scholarship, but also within the Islamic world itself for 1,000 years, for precisely the reason that you just put your hand up. The later tradition, and especially the wisdom and theosophical traditions, have done one or two things. They have conflated Idris with both Hermes Trismegistus, but also with the biblical Old Testament figure of Enoch, such that to them and to someone like Ibn Arabi, Hermes Trismegistus and Enoch are one and the same person, right? Although there was already an existing name for Enoch, or Chanoch, as the Hebrew has it, because there were Jews in Arabia, and these books of Enoch may most definitely have been known by them at that time. So then why did the later Islamic tradition make this conflation? Is a real interesting story. Kevin van Bledel, if I recall correctly, has a couple of pages or maybe even a chapter devoted to this very issue in his book, The Arabic Hermes. If you've got a copy of that, you may want to look through that. And I think he discusses what happened. But what is fascinating is that some of this goes back to ancient Iran, the Sasanian period. That it was at this point, and kind of the conflations that were happening at the hands of some of these Sasanian thinkers that were kind of transported into the Islamic world, and particularly in the late Umayyad and early Abbasid periods, where you suddenly have a conflation happen with the Quranic figure of Idris becoming both Hermes and the Jewish Enoch at the same time. And that this tradition ran with it. And it's been the kind of a typecast, because we also have in the Fusus a chapter, I believe, of Ilyas as well. So, and certainly Ibn Arabi was aware of the fact that Ilyas and Idris are sometimes conflated as well. Although some have made Idris to be the Enoch and Ilyas to refer to Elijah. You know, that has also been the case. But there's also been this debate, especially in the various chronologies that Muslim theologians have drawn of the prophets of the past, where Ilyas and Idris suddenly become the same character. And Ibn Arabi was very well aware of this. So some people, whether we're talking about his commentators or even some of the contemporary scholars of Ibn Arabi, have pointed out that why this exists in the Fusus al-Hikam is because Ibn Arabi was very well aware of this conundrum. So what he wanted to discuss about this figure in one modality, he put in the chapter of Idris. And so then once you moved on to the chapter of Ilyas in the Fusus, then he kind of brings out this other element of this character that he wanted to talk about. This is basically the consensus now about what Ibn Arabi did.
Then can we continue and say that by the virtue of this fact that Quran uses the name of Idris, if we to some level agree it is equal to Hermes, that the argument that Islamic thought inherited great philosophy, it is somehow historical accident which happened second or third century of Islamic history. It's just not true, because in the Quran itself we can trace at least some traces of this Greek thought and Greek philosophy.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and contemporary Quranic studies is actually beginning to prove that very decisively too. There's a lot of different places. So, well, I mean, it's not just Idris, not just the character of Hermes. I mean, the figure of Plotinus becomes Aristotle. So, they didn't talk about the Enneads in Islamic world. They talked about the theology of Aristotle as the Enneads, so that Aristotle becomes a two-faceted figure. One this super rationalist, and then to everybody else, he becomes this, hyper mystic in these, kind of cherry-picked sections of the Enneads that were transmitted from Greek into Arabic as the theology of Aristotle. And this becomes a real problem. The one figure that finally resolved this and realized that the theology of Aristotle was not Aristotle was Mullah Sadra. And so he very explicit. That means that by his time, there had been enough scholarship and understanding of the fact that there was an older text of this. The same goes for Proclus's Liber de Causis, the Elements of Theology, which is another important Neoplatonic text that was transmitted into the Abbasid period. There was initially a lot of doubt as to who the author of this was. And so for some time, at least in the Abbasid period, there was this belief that this was another Aristotelian text until, I think by the time of al-Farabi, it was generally recognized that this was not Aristotle. This was somebody else. Yeah. So this happened. This happened. My question is, given that the translation projects within that period were generally quite good, and the people that were working on it were quite meticulous. A lot of them were Syriac monks who initially the Abbasids employed to do these things, to translate it. Why did this confusion even emerge? Even if they only had fragments of these texts, usually their own scholarship would have been, would have referenced these sorts of things long before. So why did this confusion arise in the first place? There are very different answers to this question by contemporary historians of Islamic philosophy. But it's still kind of up in the air as to why this occurred. But do get that book, The Arabic Hermes by Kevin van Bledo. It's a very, very interesting book. And as a historical study, I think it's one of the better studies over this particular question that are out there.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Anyone else? All right. In that case, we're about 9-10 minutes short of an hour. What I will do is I will close this session for this week. Just begin the chapter of Abraham. So we have a new dhikr now with this chapter of Abraham, and that is this dhikr of Ya Muhayyimu, O enchanter. Next week, what I will do is we will cover this chapter of Abraham in a single session. It's a short chapter, and like I said, we're having the next dozen or so chapters, they're kind of receding in a number of pages, and then the big chapters that will be coming up will be, number one, the chapter of Joseph will be a very, very big chapter, very important chapter. Then after that, Jesus is a big chapter, Solomon is a big chapter, and then Moses is a big chapter, and then finally the chapter of Muhammad. So these big chapters, both big, I mean, in terms of the length, but also in terms of the topics and issues that are covered with them. We will cover those big chapters in 2 sessions, but these smaller ones from now on we'll do all in a single session. And this way, then we can go quickly through the book, hopefully maybe by the end of the year. If not, short period after that, we will have finished reading the whole of Fusus. So unless somebody has a point to make or a question or something, I will close the session for this.
Okay,
go ahead.
One practical question.
Sure.
Can you give some advice for the zikrs, how to make the zikrs to get the best experience from it?
I had a question this week at my lecture that the way that the question is asked, the answer was formulated. What we believe in this tradition generally is that, yes, of course, one has to prepare oneself for the recitation of a mantra, right? But from another vantage point, the mantra itself is the centering cause. So if you can focus yourself on the name, right, and not fight with yourself in that process and allow the name itself to possess you, okay, and you can derive from that what I just said, whatever you want. People have some very imaginative ways of allowing that to happen. But once you allow the name, the zikr, to possess you, then that zikr centers you. So then the name itself becomes the centering cause. Once you allow and it takes a while to get into the swing of it. Once that happens, basically that's where the magic occurs. This is where, and then at that point you can basically do anything. And Stephen raised again, that sounds almost voodoo. Well, voodoo is a syncretic tradition, half of which comes from Sufism. You have all these West African Sufis that were transported as slaves to the Caribbean, who basically wedded their West African Sufi tradition with Uruba and the indigenous tradition of the island. So yeah, voodoo and these loas, as far as my late wife Roya, who was a walking encyclopedia of this tradition of the Caribbean, was concerned, the loas are the jinn, basically. So that tradition. So yeah, you allow the zikr to possess you because it is the name of God, right? And within this tradition, we don't have a problem with the concept of possession. And anybody who says differently, I would kind of chat to them. I once said this to a Pentecostal Christian who got it immediately. Whereas other Christian denominations, Baptists and Methodists, etc., and even sometimes Catholics, they just cannot understand what this even means. Well, if there is such a thing as demonic possession, there must also be such a thing as divine possession. So, instead of going that other route, we want to go this route. And that, for the Sufis, this is what that means. So you let the divine name possess you, literally, to take over you. And however that is allowed to happen, you can use your imagination. I can give you even an example. Some people envision in their mind, someone they love very dearly as the embodiment of that name in their imagination, so that, for example, when they are reciting the name, that emotion that is attached to the object of their love in their mind becomes the catalyst for that possession. That's fine. As far as we're concerned, this particular tradition is concerned, this is fine to do. It's not shirk. It's none of those things. If it works and it allows that dynamic to occur, go for it. Yeah. No worries at all. Anywho, this is one of our shorter sessions. This next chapter coming up with Abraham is a great chapter, shorter one.
I had a question about what you spoke about, actually.
Go for it.
So, I know it's kind of late, but so speaking about the name and the possessing of the name. Now, when you factor in, some discussions about the servants of the name and the Hudam and all of this, how does that tie into what you're talking about with Zakat right now? How does that tie into that?
Big time. It ties in very big. But that's a very, very long, involved, convoluted conversation. Just remember this, though. This first of all, let me just bracket this by saying the following. The occult tradition that is embodied in the writings of Ahmed al-Buni and his successors and people who followed him, in many ways is both a late development and also a development that, while influenced very strongly by Ibn Arabi's thought, is also in its articulation quite sometimes very different to what Ibn Arabi is saying. And if you recall the first chapter of Adam, where Ibn Arabi is very explicit in saying that the angels represent sort of like psychic faculties of the universal being, then this whole discussion about the Khudam and Muwakkilun attached to these various names in itself is a sort of a redundancy as far as even someone like Ibn Arabi is concerned. So, whereas in the experiential dimension, these things have a reality. Yes, there are Muwakkils, there are Khudam, but from the higher perspective of what all of this means, the name is the named. And whatever emerges from the named, whether in terms of a guardian spirit or whatever, itself is an aspect of the named. Do you understand?
Yes, exactly. I understand completely.
Okay.
Now, one last thing. I know I gotta let you go. One last thing. So, when in these recitations or zikr, not just positive things come, negative things will come. Are those negative things also manifestations of the name? Yes,
because the essence is the coincidence of opposites, the coincidentia oppositorum, or the jam beina asdad. Therefore, in every particular modality of that essence, of the universal essence, which is a name, you are also going to find coincidence of opposites of various forms. Now, what this means on a practical level is that usually these things come with the practice of it, at least not initially, they don't come in the form of actual events in the outside world. They usually come in the form of thoughts and feelings and emotions that are given solic experiences. Where, for example, you take a particular name and you start to recite it constantly, and you all of a sudden have a flood of all kinds of thoughts and emotions coming. Some of these are what the Sufis call khawat, kind of the random thoughts. And then basically it becomes a challenge while you're practicing to not so much, try to banish what's coming, but to kind of remain centered and neutral into what is coming and just kind of be an observer to this torrent that is like, overflowing out of your mind or into your mind. And sometimes I've even had this experience, and this happened to me for a long time until I realized that it was not me. When you really begin to center, the more you center yourself, and the more then all of this stuff that is contained within you starts to dissipate. But then you come to a point that you start picking up on what is around you, or even outside of you, which is not yours. So, and this is where the whole psychic phenomena occurs, because at that point of centeredness, you become kind of a talisman and a magnet for everything else around you. So you start to pick up on other people's thoughts or things that are going on the outside that are not even audible sometimes, right? And then that becomes in itself a challenge to kind of, manage.
Thank you.
Welcome. Anybody else want to say something?
I would continue on with that, but I don't want to make it drag on too long. Maybe I'll wait till next week.
No, we'll go. If you have a question, ask it. Go ahead.
So it continues the same theme. So, okay. So it continues again about this about the psychic phenomenon and whatnot. But when these Hudam and whatever, and they become external manifestations, right? How does one reconcile that? If it's something that is externally manifesting outside of you, it's not a dream, not a vision, like your external manifestations, which I hope not everyone experiences that, then like how is that reconciled with only being are you then experiencing yourself outside of yourself?
Very simple. Very simple. It's very easily explainable. From the ultimate perspective, there is no inside or outside.
Fair enough.
These are all placeholders for creatures that are existing within phenomena. So to put it in the terms of Kantian epistemology, from the point of view of noumena, there is no al-zahir, the outward, and no al-batin, the hidden. From that point of view, it is all the same. So, for example, if you get really deep into the recitation of a name, or even if you're invoking something in terms of a magical operation, and phenomena start occurring, and you actually see things sometimes, literally, you see them, then they are there. No other way to explain it.
Yeah, so they're not like projections of your mind or whatever. They actually exist.
Well, they are, but they aren't. But from what I'm trying to say, that from this perspective, everything is a projection of the mind. It's not just your mind; it's the projection of the universal mind.
Understood.
Right. So we want to get away from this whole Cartesian fallacy of putting the mind as a kind of a solipsistic generator of phenomena. This whole thing, this is where Descartes kind of went off the rails, is that it's not the case that cogito ergo sum, that I think therefore I am. The fact is that it is the cogitor that is behind what is being thought, the real thinker, the universal thinker that is producing you as you are. This is what also Ibn Arabic just said in this chapter as well. You know, you are not you and he is not he, which then as another term of the dialectic is true. So the mind or consciousness or whatever other term you want to use, in a particular instantiation, right, is only momentarily fixed in a vehicle. But that substance, for lack of a better word of putting it, is universal. So that it isn't the case that, you know, a vessel is cogitating its existence and therefore it exists. The existence is first, and therefore the cogitation of the particularity is occurring as a consequence. Right?
And
that
would
the
make
existence is universal, and the essences, or what Ibn Arabi puts it as the ta'ayyun, you know, the self-identification is occurring as a result of that universality. So this essentially right here breaks apart the entire basis of Cartesian epistemology as being wrong, being completely backwards. The cogitor is completely something else. So if that is the case, if the cogitor is something else and is universal, then once you have centered and once your subtle bodies open up and and your mind open up and you start to see things, and the veils proverbially drop, then, for example, in the course of a magical operation, you see things. In the course of doing zikr, you see things. It often occurs that, you know, you have the ability to do certain things that, you know, rational thoughts and rational, you know, approaches to the mind-body dichotomy cannot explain adequately. These things happen. Anyone who has been on a path such as this, and in whatever iteration of this kind of approach, has experienced all of these things. When we're talking about Sufis, Agoris, Taoists, Buddhists, Native American, or Native Australasian shamans, on and on it goes.
That makes sense. So essentially, all that happens at that moment is that your expansion of your experience of what's already happened, just experiencing more than you would experience normally.
Yes.
And it's already happening whether you experience it or not.
Yeah. Look at it this way. The human mind, just like the human body, you can look at it as a kind of like an amplifier with a volume knob, tone and treble and bass and all of that sort of thing. Mundane experience is kind of modulated at a certain volume, at a certain treble, at a certain bass, a certain tone, etc. The esoteric path and its various practices from whatever tradition that they are, when properly implemented, and when the novice has a commitment to these practices and does something every day, and deepens that practice day by day by day by day, is basically then turning up the knobs and rearranging the modulations of the treble and the bass, etc., on their own mind. That's basically what's happening. Because all of these things that are experienced are already here in front of us. It's just that in our mundane consciousness of things, we happen not to, apprehend them. That's it. So, a spiritual practice, a real good esoteric transmission and initiation, basically is offering you the tools to be able to just basically turn the knobs of your own volume and treble and bass. You already amplifier. Jeff liked that analogy. So I'm talking his language then.
Yeah, turn it up to 11.
Yeah.
Spinal Tap.
Spinal Tap, exactly. Yeah. So that's basically what we're talking about. So But what my own sheikh would always tell me, because, you know, some of the early zikrs that he gave me, they were powerful and weird stuff started to happen almost immediately. So, you know, he basically, you know, constantly reassure me, yes, you know, what you're seeing, you're not going crazy. That's fine. Just don't give it any energy. Don't, just observe it like you're sitting in a car and you're passing by and you're seeing, you're seeing various scenery on the way. Just look at it that way. Don't give it any energy. Even observe it, but don't give it any energy. It's there. You just keep going. Okie dokie. We have gone a little bit over an hour. Discussion was good today. Missed a couple of people who didn't show up. Anyway, so let's start on the chapter of Abraham and then until next week. Ya Allah.